Here at the Morse Force. I want to share some of my thoughts about my interview a couple of days ago with E. Michael Jones, who is a significant scholar whom I have a lot of respect for, and who is the author of The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, and who reflects a very traditional, if you will, Orthodox Catholic view on Judaism. I'm also responding generally here to some of the comments made on the YouTube channel about his interview, some of which are pretty tough, but I'm not going to go into that. And the more I think about it, the more I believe that, or at least my thinking at this point, is that while Michael Jones differentiates between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, and rightfully, he points out that anti-Semitism is a race theory, which is despicable, and which I think, most reasonable people, all reasonable people, reject the idea that we are who we are because of our biological ancestry, and can be judged for that. To the idea of anti-Judaism, which is his opposition to Judaism as a faith and as an ideology, which he views as bad. That the anti-Judaism aspect of his approach, while well-meaning and while certainly very well presented, is actually more dangerous than anti-Semitism. Because if you believe that Judaism is ideologically and spiritually problematic as opposed to Jews as a race, then you can apply that ideology to anything. And say, oh, this is a Judaizing influence. And in fact, that's what he does in the first 640 pages of his book. There are very few Jews in that part of the book. It's all Judaizing influences because of his premise that Judaism is a revolutionary faith. So by that means, he can contradictorily apply this Judaizing aspect to enemies of the Catholic Church, like the Albigensian heresy, or like Jan Hus and his Bohemian movement, the Hussites, which came just before the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation itself, Martin Luther, he applies it to some of the more radical elements of the Protestant movement, like the Anabaptists. He applies it to the British Church and the breakaway by Elizabeth II, and then Cromwell, that these all he considered to be, quote, Judaizing influences because of their ideology. And that presentation has some major contradictions. On the one hand, he makes the case that it's Judaizing because they have a very strict adherence to what Christians call the Old Testament, what Jews call the Torah, which means that they can be warlike and that they can, engage in violence against their enemies, like the ancient Israelites were commanded to do by God in the first, or the second, actually the third conquest of the Holy Land. And thus you have a Judaizing influence because of this strict interpretation of the Torah. Now that, of course, takes away the fact that the Judeans, particularly after the destruction of the Second Temple, but in a trend that actually goes quite a bit further back than that, began to codify and analyze what's called the oral law, or the Talmud, which explained and put into context these Torah passages in such a way that they can be observed in their own present times. That because God ordered the ancient Israelites to kill the Amalekites, that's not to kill anybody today, because there are no Amalekites. That was very unique to a particular time and a particular place and to a particular people. Why God wanted the Jews to kill the Amalekites, that's something that, is up to rabbinical debate. It's not totally understood. It's a spiritual question, though, today. It's not a literal question. Jews are not commanded to kill anybody today. There are no Amalekites. But some radical Protestant sects, like the Hussites, I suppose, they took it upon themselves to defeat their enemies militarily using those passages, and wrongfully. That would not be Judaizing at all, because Judaism also has the Talmud, which contemporizes those things, puts them in a spiritual context. And yet, Michael Jones also accuses Protestant sects like the Calvinists of being Talmudists. So which is it? The Old Testament or the Talmud? That's a major contradiction. But the point I'm making here also is that this idea that you can apply Judaizing, the label Judaizing, to any of these things without actually having any Jews involved, or, some tenuous side players of Jews, because Jews were in Europe after all, and they were influenced by these things. It makes it worse than anti-Semitism, because at least with anti-Semitism, you have to have real Jews. And the qualities that he places on the Jewish revolutionary spirit, and I think I got into some of this during the interview, are qualities that actually are anti-Jewish, that the Jewish movement, the Jewish faith, was infiltrated by some of the same enemies that eventually infiltrated the Christian churches, particularly Protestant churches, and later on the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was much more inoculated against these things because the Catholic Church, to its advantage, has a pope, it has a Holy See, it has a hierarchy, it has a structure that can withstand these kinds of influences. But these influences are not Jewish. They are alien to Judaism. But they unfortunately infiltrated Judaism, starting really with the advent of the false Messiah, the Shabtai Zvi. Now, I get into this actually in one of my books, that is Left-Wing Anti-Semitism. And, so when you start to list Jews who, for example, were revolutionaries in Russia, these are Jews who, they were either half Jews or they were Jews who had left the faith completely, or they had made pretensions to being Jewish, but they had embraced the very ideas that are antithetical to the Jewish covenant with God. They were trying to replace God with themselves as messiahs, as man, changing human nature. And that is the very antithesis of Judaism and Christianity. That is what God warned us about in the Torah when he talked about idol worship. That is the whole principle of Judaism. That's what Judaism gave to the world, a rejection of those ideas. And the fact that some people who call themselves Jews embrace those ideas is a terrible disgrace, and it is something, by the way, that I believe that Judaism needs to come to terms with and hasn't, because they remain so powerful, that being these left-wing, revolutionary, messianic, earthly-oriented Jews, or so-called Jews. So the locus of the problem is not Judaism. It is this communist conspiracy, which is what I would call it, that actually goes back, according to a theory put forth by Whittaker Chambers, the great American communist who became a Christian and who I am a great admirer of, and I recommend his book, The Witness, that it's the second oldest faith known to man. It's the faith of the Garden of Eden, when Eve was tempted by the serpent, who represents Satan, to partake of the tree of knowledge, to understand good and evil, to overthrow God, to make man the center of the universe. And that is the very struggle of the ancient Israelites and the rabbinic authorities all the way up till today. And it's a struggle that, quite frankly, Judaism has largely lost. And we need to recover. Just like Christianity, to a certain extent, needs to recover from this terrible scourge. So I don't believe that it is a Jewish revolutionary spirit. I believe it is a revolutionary spirit that has co-opted, infiltrated, and perverted Judaism. And that Jewish people need to wake up to this and get back to who our real nature is, which is a belief in the Lord God, King of the universe, blessed be he. And as far as the Christian contention that Judaism is revolutionary because we did not accept Jesus as the Messiah, I respect that. I understand that, because if you do believe in the Messiah as Jesus, then yes, you think that anyone who rejected Jesus is subversive, must be deliberately trying to undermine the true messianic movement. And certainly Jews are at the top of that list, because we were there back then. We were Judeans. Jesus himself was a Judean. And so there's a particular outrage at Jews, and Jews are particularly susceptible to this kind of theory. All I can say about that is that Jews and Christians are never going to agree on that, because from my perspective as a Jew, and I say this putting aside the question of divinity for Jesus, which is a Christian question, we have our own belief system that stands completely separate from Christianity or any other religion. We believe that we are part of a covenant that emerged from Sinai, and that covenant is to live by and to uphold and to promote the moral and ethical precepts of the Torah as given by God through Moses. And that we have a purpose in that regard. We base our faith on that covenant. And as far as the Messiah is concerned, we wait for the Messiah, but we do not, movements to try to claim that the Jewish people are the Messiah, or that the Messiah, we can make the Messiah come by force of arms, is completely antithetical to Judaic understanding. The idea of the Messiah in a Jewish context is that we need to purify ourselves spiritually and personally and live a more holy life, and to try to adhere to more and more the principles of the Torah, so that we can create an atmosphere by which the Messiah will come on his own accord, according to God, somehow mystically, not by the doings of man, and that when that happens, all the nations of the world will know God. That's the belief. And that, yes, there is a little bit of a physical part of it. And that physical part is that the Judeans, or who we call today the Jews, need to reassert sovereignty in that little tiny speck of land, about the same size as the state of New Jersey, that is called Israel. And the borders of Israel are very clearly and carefully delineated in the Torah and in the Tanakh. And that is that little land between the Jordan River and the Great Sea, which is the Mediterranean. And that, by the way, is exactly where Israel, the modern state of Israel, exists. So that's been fulfilled. The next step is obviously to rebuild the temple. And that, again, is not something that can be done by force. It cannot be pushed. It can be done by prayer. It can be done by the Jewish people trying to make themselves more holy and to understand morality and ethics, and to get back to the true meaning of the Torah. And then if we do that, that's how it's going to happen, not by force. I'm not an advocate of having a bunch of people go out there and start to try to rebuild the temple. That's heretical, in my opinion. We need to improve our lives and ourselves, and thus become the true meaning of what the light unto the nations is, a concept that has been misinterpreted both by anti-Semites and by radical revolutionary Jews, who think that it has to be done by creating a one-world government with a dictator and a total equality, which is a world ant colony. An idea that the Torah and Judaism and God has warned us about and railed against. So, those are some of my thoughts on the interview I just did with E. Michael Jones, whom I have a lot of respect for and I hope to have back. And by the way, I apologize for the technical problems in that I lost his voice toward the end of the show. I am pretty ham-handed when it comes to technicalities, and I'm learning. I think I figured out the problem. It has a lot to do with regulating the levels of sound coming both out of my mic and out of my guest's mic. So it's going to get better, and please, I ask for your forgiveness about that. I've been criticized, and rightfully for that, but it's going to get better, God willing. Anyway, thanks for watching, everybody, and have a great afternoon.